Good evening, viewers in Thailand, and good day to those abroad. I'm Gwen Robinson, past president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, and we're here tonight to discuss Myanmar's post-coup economy. Is it doomed to fail? First, I'd just like to update viewers on the club and apologise that we had to cancel the physical attendance to this event at the last minute. Thailand is now in yet another semi-lockdown, and the club will be more or less closed for a month, although the office will be open every day during the week for general matters, memberships, and also we do have a campaign going on for used electronic equipment. If anyone wants to donate any used computers, laptops, etc., to help Myanmar media. So bear that in mind, and we will reopen again at the end of the month. So turning right away to our panel tonight, I'd like to introduce our speakers, and first we'll have Vicky Bowman, Director, Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business; Nyanta Morlin, an independent Myanmar analyst; Jason Tao, who's sitting right next to me, Myanmar Country Director for think tank USIP; and on the bottom right of the screen, Thompson Chow, Editor-at-Large, Frontier Myanmar. On the upper right-hand, who got up very early to join us from Boston, is Ardith Tongmoon, Chair and Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. And I think anyone who's watching this is probably very aware of the crisis that has set in Myanmar since the February 1st coup, and has watched in horror as what was one of Southeast Asia's most vibrant economies has collapsed into a state of semi-paralysis amid surge of spiralling urban attacks, conflicts in ethnic areas, and a growing number of People's Defence Forces that are targeting facilities and officials of the self-proclaimed State Administration Council. Meanwhile, the economy is flailing. More than 880 civilians have been killed and at least 6,400 arrested as of yesterday. And we are watching as the junta tightens surveillance and continues arrests and actions against any sign of opposition, particularly amongst school teachers, doctors, professionals and ordinary workers. In turn, obviously, the economy can only suffer as a result of this paralysis. Let's not also forget COVID-19 with very low levels of testing, which are really showing up some very alarming levels of the coronavirus spreading in the country. Joblessness is rising along with poverty levels, and the World Food Programme has warned that as much as half the population may be unable to access adequate food supplies by the year end. And yet, one of the reasons we wanted to do this panel tonight is that in the main city centres, in some areas and in some respects, there is a semblance of what you could call a new normal, as dysfunctional as it is, which has seen the tentative resumption of some trade, a reopening of some factories, and meanwhile the junta, anxious to look like it is succeeding, and I think there's very severe doubts of that claim, is announcing foreign investment projects, mainly, we think, initiated by Chinese, some Russian and Vietnamese business interests. So the upshot and the question, I think, for panellists tonight is there any hope for Myanmar's economy, or, as some suggest, is it on a path to complete collapse, and what are the consequences? So I think with that happy question, I'll turn over to Vicky Bowman of the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business, who's going to give us a rundown and I think give her typically exacting and broad view of what's going on. So over to you, Vicky. I can see you're sharing your screen already.
Thank you very much, Gwen. Thank you for inviting me. So yes, I hope you can see my slides. I will rush through them. If anyone wants to have a copy, do get in touch with me. I'm happy to share. But what I thought I would do is cover some of the commercial challenges that businesses are facing and the state of the economy. Thompson's also going to talk a bit more about that, as are other speakers. And then talk also about the responsible business challenges and dilemmas that businesses are facing and the expectations on them from investors and also the advice that we're giving. So to kick off, in terms of current commercial challenges, I think everyone is very familiar with the banking sector disruption, which is impacting on everyone. I'm not sure whether it's getting better or not. Certainly it is to some extent becoming the new normal, although there are changes from week to week in terms of limits on withdrawals. The central bank is busy assuring the banks that things will get better, and this seems to be linked to the expectation that the Agricultural Development Bank is going to inject money into the economy between July and September in the form of loans from farmers. But in the meantime, as some of the other panel speakers I think will draw attention to, this is having a really serious effect on SMEs, on the agricultural sector, and certainly on any sector that needs to pay cash to its suppliers and its workers, such as construction in particular. And what you're seeing is that many government tenders for road construction projects and so on are failing to be delivered because the companies can't get the cash from the government banks to pay the workers. They're only being paid via bank transfer. So it's very much about a shortage of cash in circulation, and part of that has obviously been driven by the fact that the main cash printer for the government, Gesiche and Different, a German company, stopped helping them back in February. But it was also brought on in particular by the internet shutdown that the government threw at the entire country without thinking what the economic consequences would be of that. To some extent, and partly because they have woken up to the extremely negative effect this has had on any form of electronic payment. So to some extent, that's now back working. Mobile data is broadly available, and banking apps and others can be used around the country. But it has given a huge knock to confidence in e-payment systems at a time when now the government and, I'm talking about the military government obviously, and the banking system and retailers are all trying to get people back onto trying to use digital payments. Then the confidence crisis caused by the coup has impacted the chat. That's led to devaluation of the chat and also a significant increase in inflation across the board of imported goods such as fuel, which then has a knock-on effect on domestically traded goods such as crops. So we're seeing across the board price increases over the last few months. So logistics, overall a 30% increase in fuel, and then there are wider problems in logistics, although perhaps not as severe as they were back in March. In particular, the seaports are broadly functioning. What they're suffering from is that sea traffic generally, the costs have increased, and there's a shortage of boats because boats started to be cancelled to go to Yangon, and also because of things like the Suez crisis and COVID more generally. So the other challenges for businesses are keeping their employees and their customers safe. In particular, it's a combination of safety from the military and the police, but also safety from the forces of whatever nature who are going around mounting explosions and arson attacks. Part of the problem that businesses then face is if they are offered security by the military government, they don't want to take that because that will actually increase their security risk. So they're trying as best they can to manage the risks to workers and customers and to stay open in the case of banks, shops and so on. COVID, you've mentioned already, and then just generally the overall depressed economy, the increased political risk is having a huge impact on the entire economy, both at the grassroots level, which I think Ardeth is going to talk about, survival strategies at local level, but also I've calculated it's more than 90% of expats, repats have left, and that's on the basis of talking to some embassies about how many they had pre-COVID compared to now, and all of that has a knock-on effect, particularly on the Yangon economy. And then you're seeing what were already pretty unhealthy businesses with a lot of non-performing loans due to COVID, and even prior to that, that they're suffering more. And so increasingly Myanmar companies are closing down, and I think that Thompson's going to talk a little bit about some of the surveys on that. And all of this is having an impact on jobs. Construction, a major employer, but also garments, and the tourism industry is effectively completely dead now, and that was almost 1 million jobs a few years ago. Then moving on to the policies of the State Administration Council, such as we can see of them, they're also not really helping the business community. There are some which look like a continuation of pre-coup policies, a strong focus on agriculture and livestock, and I think that every business person I talk to seems to sort of pin their hopes that this will continue to come through. But then, and also a repeat of some of the not particularly well-guided policies of the NLD government, such as the way that they did the solar power tender. But then we're starting to really see a revival of some of these failed policies around state-owned factories, around autarky, sort of domestic production, domestic self-reliance that we used to see under the SPDC, and I've listed a few of them here. And some of them also are very much tied into negative economic impacts, such as this focus on perennial crops and oil palm, and on trying to restart some of these hydropower dams. Personally, I think this is not under the pressure of potential Chinese or Thai investors. I think this is coming from the SAC itself, but interested to hear what Jason has to say on that. Looking to the National Unity Government, from the democratically elected members of Parliament and others, it's been good to see that they are positive about investment so long as it's responsible. And this is something that's a comment or a paragraph at the end of a recent announcement they made about Myanmar Investment Commission permits, which tied very much into the work that we've always done in MCRB in encouraging businesses to apply the responsibility to respect under the UN Guiding Principles. What does that mean in practice now? There were already many, many challenges in doing business responsibly in Myanmar, even under the NLD government, related, for example, to the legal framework, to the mess around land rights, to a very sort of incipient trade unionization, freedom of association, which meant there were still plenty of labour rights abuses. Corruption, although the previous Anti-Corruption Commission under Uaun Chi had got very good marks in regional polling, but that's now, he has left, and that's progress has completely disappeared. And then issues related to discrimination and also how to do investment in conflict-affected areas. But we would now consider the entire country as a conflict-affected area, whereas previously we were much more looking at the areas which had ethnic-driven conflicts, and then, of course, COVID. But now a whole new raft of challenges for doing business responsibly, for respecting human rights. I've touched on some of them already about the safety risk. So particularly thinking businesses are having to think around where they might have some sort of interaction with public security. This is important for the banks. It was very important for the supermarkets and shopping malls during the CDM, where you had military coming into these premises, which led to them deciding to close rather than risk putting anybody at risk. And then for employees facing risks coming to and from work, the risk of being shot, the risk of being stopped, the risk of having your mobile phone taken off you and checked, and if you're using Facebook, you could be charged with 505A. So we're seeing an awful lot of employee-related challenges that businesses are having to take account of, including divisions within their own workplace, which has become quite significant, and certainly ever since the sort of social punishment movement started to have an impact within workplaces. Banking we've already talked about, but that in itself has safety risks for employees if people are starting to demand cash for their salaries rather than bank payments. Privacy, data protection, actually the SAC brought in a new data protection law effectively with amending the Electronic Transactions Act. But many of the demands from the military government since then have been actually in breach of that act, such as demands for data on all banking transactions for 3 months, and other ones which were reported, like asking or demanding from internet companies the names and addresses of all their subscribers. Then one of the challenges that businesses are facing is misinformation about their activities, about whether they have themselves have military connections to their business. And this has potentially quite a safety impact if misinformation is out there, because it can lead to the businesses being targeted, including with violence. So it's very important that where there is misinformation out there, that companies do respond to it quickly, and also are proactive in being transparent. One of the biggest challenges that the businesses are facing is this whole issue of tax payment and their legal obligations versus the desire of their employees and other stakeholders for them not to pay tax. Most of them, I would say, are playing the issue long when they're able to do so. And part of the issue there is the disruption of banking system and tax offices themselves. And then for me, probably the biggest sort of question mark, which I don't think we've really seen evidence of yet fully, but it may well come given the other signs, is if we start to see a reversal back to the old days of cronyism, of a lack of level playing field, of more corruption. And I think it's that which will be the deciding factor on whether businesses actually pull out. To date, most closures, most suspensions, with a few exceptions, have been related to commercial decisions. You know, they just can't make money. But I think in future, this will become potentially more important unless we see a significant change in the overall direction of the country. So investors in companies are gearing up increasingly to interrogate the companies who are present in Myanmar and who are doing business in Myanmar with questions to them about how they're managing their human rights risk, their responsible business risk. And again, they're using the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights as the framework for asking these questions. Specifically, this investor alliance, which is about $4 billion worth of investment, mostly American, European, has been asking the following questions of the companies it invests in. But it's important to realize that these are also now, particularly with the sort of globalized investment portfolio, these are questions being asked of Asian companies as well, because many investors in American universities, in British investment trusts, they will be investing in Korean companies, Indian companies, Thai companies, Chinese companies. So this is now becoming the framework for questions and demands to companies about what they should be doing. So how can companies respond? So definitely engaging with these investor coalitions, being ready both to know, in other words, do their due diligence and keep doing it as the situation changes, but also show what they're doing. So knowing and showing is the term that's usually used around the UN Guiding Principles. Showing through being transparent. So it's in the company's interest to have accurate information on their websites about who owns them, and responding when they get inquiries from the media. Making statements themselves, particularly if they're under specific scrutiny. So here are a few examples of companies who have made statements along the way in the last few months. And then engaging in collective action with other companies. So what we've seen is, particularly in the garment sector, there's been a lot of work between a number of different garment brands, mostly from Europe, talking and negotiating with the Myanmar trade unions and the global trade union Industrial on issues such as, just most recently, how they will ensure that workers who couldn't come back to work after April because they were sort of targeted as activists, how those workers can nonetheless get their redundancy pay and get to be eligible for some of the donor support programs which are going on. So that was an arrangement which was announced by the ACT Alliance a couple of days ago. And then support to humanitarian action, I think, is going to become increasingly a priority for companies if they can work out ways to do it, particularly support around COVID and COVID vaccines. And that's going to require the involvement of development partners as well, the donors, in terms of trying to establish ways in which this can be done in a way which is politically acceptable and maintains business integrity, in other words, not corrupt, but also maintains, very importantly, the medical integrity for doing vaccinations and ensuring supply chains and so on. Thank you very much. Over to the next speaker, which I think...
well, Vicky, thanks very much. You can come back on screen now. So we can thank you very much. I was just going to say, before we move to Nyanta, in all that data, I was wondering if you are one of the people I've seen really analysing close up what information we can get, and it's very difficult to get reliable data now, as you well know. Have you got, what do you think of the various forecasts of where the economy is at now in terms of the decline in GDP growth? I've heard minus 20% or worse. I mean, it does, that kind of picture you painted does suggest quite serious...
It is very bleak, because one can just look at the number of months in which the economy was more or less shut down. I mean, this is not something MCRB does, but we've had minus 10% from the World Bank. We've had minus 13% from Oxford economists. I think we're expecting another World Bank report imminently. They're better number crunchers than we are. Right. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if we were looking at minus 20%, but it won't be across, even across all sectors. It will definitely be affecting certain sectors more, such as construction, whereas agriculture is still looking relatively positive, and in some cases we're even seeing increases in some cross-border trade and some commodities.
Right, very interesting. I think we had minus 20% from Fitch ratings, Fitch Group, a bit earlier, but as you say, it's extremely mixed. So Nyanta, you have worked a bit on agriculture and have been watching events going on there, so perhaps you could give us your take on whether the economy is on a doomed to fail track.
Thank you, Gwen. Thanks for that presentation, Vicky. I'll speak a little bit, I think, from what I'm seeing within the agricultural sector. I do think with agriculture, it is an industry where it has to keep going. Farmers aren't afforded the flexibility. They have to work to the cycles of seasons, of weather. But the issue is that if you think about what holds up the sector, it's still reliant on supply chains that require imports of particular inputs. Particularly for cash crops, that means seed, that means fertilizer. And I would say that the disruption in trade, including border trade, in the early months since the February 1st crisis, have caused significant challenges at the farm level. So what has been the response then is that you may see much less availability of certain kinds of seeds. So farmers are turning to new sources. This has always been a challenge, by the way, and it's a problem for various reasons. In terms of ensuring the quality of imported seed. You're talking about germination. You're talking about the risk of there are phytosanitary concerns, that concerns with performance. But nevertheless, I think farmers have had to make do, and that has been covered mainly because my argument is that if you think about the key cash crops, right, that hold up most of the ag and rural economy, crops like rice, beans and pulses, corn. It typically by about January and February, which is when the coup happened, most of the crops would have already been in the hands of traders and wholesalers and aggregators, right? So already off the hands of farmers, typically meaning they have been paid for. But the challenge is the season now, since the coup. And the challenge is, the extent to which there has been enough financing available, the access to the inputs that I mentioned, and the ability to grow, to run farm operations. And since the start of the rainy season, meaning for most crops around May, June, which is basically right now, over the past month or so. And I on that front, I am a little bit concerned. I am concerned because I think that the results of that are not visible. If anybody tells you it is, it's, let's see. We won't know how this season is doing until probably October, November, or towards the tail end of this year. And what we see are the logistical challenges that Vicky has touched on. We've talked about the challenge of access to input, but also the difficulties around banking and how that has compounded into the field. So a typical farmer, they need to get financing in hand at or before the start of the season, right? And the extent to which that has happened, I have questions about. The next challenge will come at harvest. You need money to make money. You need financing to harvest. And typically the easiest sources of financing and capital out in rural Myanmar are not coming from the state banks. It's coming from the aggregators themselves. It's coming from the brokers who have pre-financed a season, who are financing the harvest. And the difficulty with the banking system, I think, is going to make that a challenge, because automatically you're already paying a premium just for access to cash, which is what you actually need out in rural Myanmar, right? It's not quite at the stage where you're going to be able to make digital payments for equipment, for labor, if it's manually harvested. So that, on top of the other challenges, will make this harvest season particularly difficult. And then, assuming that that markets remain the same, that shipping does get normalized, perhaps there is a chance, for some stability. But even there, what we have to keep in mind, and I just spoke on this earlier this morning, it's primarily around the risk of conflict, because what we see right now is not yet, I think, a full indication of what can become in the coming months. And that risk is real. That risk, in addition to the threat to lives and, I think, livelihoods, it will potentially have an impact on quote unquote, the regular flow of business. And when you have a situation like that, you already have farmers that that have taken a hit over the past year since COVID, and that extending into another season. The compound effect into downstream industries, I think the additional challenges around consumer spending power, all of this, and then the difficulties, of course, of assuring access to typical export markets, that might be less of a challenge, because the demand is certainly there, right? And that really is the opportunity that Myanmar has had in the COVID environment. But getting it to market may pose enough of a challenge that, depending on whether that continues into the following year and these conditions remain difficult, farmers operate on very thin margins, right? And farmers have always been at risk. So the best example I turned to was Nargis. And Nargis, that's over.
Right, that's
close
the
to 20 years
cyclone
ago.
in
2008.
2008.
And you had the devastating effect of the storm, but really it was also the inability, for different reasons, but with the same result, of farmers to be able to grow on time, grow at the scale and with the investment needed. And getting that kind of, sequential hits have a massive effect at the rural level, and become a cause for food insecurity, if you're talking about cash crops, but also staple crops that supply the country. And they pose challenges for the ability of farmers to rebound, right?
Right.
So it's not, the agricultural economy is not only on thin margins, but is almost virtually with no safety net. And we've seen the effects of Nargis, not just because of the storm, but like I said, the economic effects that followed. It resulted in lots of migration. It resulted in the exponential growth in satellite towns like Klein Daya on the outskirts of Yangon. and it forces all kinds of, I think, difficult choices for communities. And it's a little bit early to say, but my concern is, given all these, these confluence of factors, I think on the food security and economic front, I remain very concerned.
Right.
I'll stop here.
Nyanta, thanks. You raised some important issues we'll come back to, but just very briefly before we move on, I just wanted to ask you, you raised mainly economic issues that of course are deeply intertwined with the post-coup situation, but what about, we keep reading about the proliferation, for example, of, the resistance movement and opposition has spread to even down to village level in remote rural areas. So what, is it also a factor of deeply hitting agriculture about things like CDM, the civil disobedience movement, the upsurge in conflict in certain areas, mainly ethnic, but also now this new spread of violence and fear and instability in a lot of country towns and even villages. Do you think the political and how it relates to CDM generally?
Yeah, so rather than CDM, which I presume you mean the disobedience movement, primarily of the public sector employees, government, civil servants, etc., and some private sector employees. I mean, rather than that, because I think the effects of that have already been made, it's really the risk of conflict, right? And what I would say, the escalating risk of conflict. I don't think the SAC is in control of that. If you look at, I mean, this is slightly outside the scope of this conversation, but if you look at the trend in attacks, whether you're talking about the bombings, whether you're talking about targeted attacks against SAC-appointed administrators and informants, whether you're talking about military attacks on military outposts and convoys, we're at a stage countrywide, and this might not always be so visible in Yangon, but it's also certainly happening, and it has happened in Yangon. But you're at a stage where you are having at least one, if not more, attacks a day. And this is, as a result of the many people that I think have gone out, that have, in essence, chosen a particular form of resistance to the coup and are coming back. But it's really that first wave. And what we can say and what we can see is that will only increase, right? So slightly outside of our conversation, but the overall, I think, ecosystem, if you're in the agricultural space, in that, and in that kind of context and where it's headed,
right?
Yes, I think this is a serious part of the challenge to the stabilization of the economy.
Right. Thank you. I think that's a thing we'll come back to, and just a little note to viewers before we move on to Jason Tower is that, sorry, we had some problems with YouTube and Facebook channels that we're streaming on. I think all those problems are fixed now, but if you are experiencing some difficulty on one of those channels, you could always try the other. We're streaming on both Facebook and YouTube on FCC Thai. Also, you will see you can ask questions which to any of the panelists, so just post those. I think Facebook is a better avenue for those questions, and if I don't get to them, perhaps you could try posting on Facebook, but we do welcome questions. We'll turn to those after the speaker presentation. So moving along now, over to Jason Tao, Myanmar Country Director, USIP, who has some great insights, not just into Chinese investment, the Belt and Road projects and China's view of the Myanmar situation. I think also broadly the work you've done on the illicit economy is also vital in this respect. So over to you, Jason.
Thanks, Gwen, and I'll try and touch a little bit on both of those issues here. I think the key point that I'd like to highlight is that while on one level you've seen the Tatmadaw really work to try to woo Chinese investors and to maintain support of the Chinese government and Chinese corporate entities more broadly, you've really seen, I think, the coup and the ultimate violence and chaos that's ensued have a rather extraordinary impact on a lot of the Chinese projects as well. And so I'll try to delve into some examples of both how that is happening as well as how we're seeing also a rise in the illicit economy during the period following February 1st. So I have a few slides that I'll throw up to help work through some of this material. But I think a starting point is just really to look at what the picture of China-Myanmar economic cooperation looked like before the coup. And as you can see from this graphic here, there had been quite a lot of developments in terms of China and Myanmar building out kind of a conceptually a roadmap for the China-Myanmar economic corridor during the first term of the NLD government. Few things to note here is that you'll see from the map that there is a significant portion of this corridor that is a domestic portion within China. And Yunnan province is really at the center of this, where part of Yunnan's own development strategy is to use its connectivity to Myanmar and its ultimate access through Myanmar to the Indian Ocean to bolster its own economic development and to attract resources not only from across China but from across the globe into Yunnan province, predicated on the ability of Yunnan to leverage those connections that it offers to Myanmar and ultimately to the Indian Ocean. So just before the coup, you were seeing a lot of agreements moving forward on the various projects. You had seen Yunnan successfully attract upwards of $100 billion in investments into Yunnan province, a lot of that being centered in Kunming and immediately in the China-Myanmar border areas where there has been a plan built out for what are referred to as these cross-border economic cooperation zones, which I'll go into a little bit more detail here later in the presentation. But you'd seen really that move ahead remarkably quickly and really pick up pace in the last couple of years of the NLD's first term. So generally speaking, you had, I think, from the vantage point of a lot of Chinese economic stakeholders, Myanmar increasingly being a priority country for Southeast Asia, and Yunnan being able to successfully bring in a lot of capital based on those relationships in Myanmar. Of course, one thing to point out is that all of these projects, given that we're looking at things like highway projects, multi-billion-dollar railroad projects, port projects, they're all things that require high levels of stability. So when the coup hit, of course, we saw really all of this turned upside down. And I think a lot of Chinese investors have been grappling with a lot of the same challenges that Vicky talked about in her presentation, that look more broadly at the business sector. Of course, post-coup, you've seen the Tatmadaw really trying to signal to Chinese investors that it wants to provide strong support for China's strategic investments in country. And I think if you look at some of the members of the Tatmadaw State Administrative Council and some of the narratives that they've worked to try to create over the past couple of years, even before the coup, and of course post-coup, you'll see. But essentially the point I was making is that the State Administrative Council has really emphasized that it wants to move ahead quite rapidly with a lot of the Chinese investments, particularly those related to the China-Myanmar economic corridor. And it's also criticized or been heavily critical of the NLD's approach, which was to subject many of those projects to reviews of feasibility studies, as well as to look at environmental and social impacts around some of the projects. So if I could go quickly to the next slide. The Tatmadaw has also taken over the various committees that have been set up to manage the Chinese projects in country. So you've seen over the past 2 months the Tatmadaw essentially place the state administrative council members as well as senior generals into management positions over the Belt and Road Committee, as well as over a lot of the other committees that are overseeing the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor projects, as well as some of the special economic zones in country. Now here, this chart shows you a number of the projects that the Tatmadaw has either given approval to post-coup or signaled that it has the intentions to move forward with quickly in the post-coup period. And what I'd like to highlight here is that all of these are projects that are along that China-Myanmar economic corridor, either located at the entry points of the corridor in Kachin and Shan states up in the China border area, or down in Rakhine state, where interestingly you have perhaps a slightly higher level of stability and less violent conflict in the post-coup period with comparison to November or earlier last year. Just highlighting a few of these. You've seen approvals for multi-million-dollar zones in Kachin State, including the SAC's Myanmar Investment Commission giving approval to the Kampati Cross-Border Economic Cooperation Zone, which is led by a key Chinese company. You've also seen approval for the LNG to power project in Irrawaddy Division, which is a $2.5 billion project involving largely Yunnan-based companies, but with some of that capital going through an entity in the UK. And then some more movements very recently on the Chop-U Special Economic Zone, which is upwards of $2.7 billion US. And again, I think plays into this notion also that there is kind of a new normal that's there in Rakhine State to move ahead with some of these investments. I think the reality, though, and that Chinese investors are increasingly waking up to this as you're seeing a lot of their projects engulfed in the violence that is happening across the country, is that this is really not at all a rosy picture. China is facing massive costs as a result of the coup. I think, first of all, looking at the border trade, you've seen a 30% reduction in the border trade in the months since the coup. You've also seen further impacts on economic projects as a result of the explosion of COVID-19 in the country. And in fact, this has also posed costs for Yunnan province, which is suffering as a result of cross-border infections in cities like Rayleigh, where actually the party secretary of Rayleigh was taken down by the Yunnan provincial government for failing to prevent COVID-19 from coming back in across the border. So the COVID implications and the amount of resources that China is having to invest in the border area to deal with the health crisis also, I think, are costs that are really extending from the coup as well. In addition, you've seen attacks on Chinese factories across Yangon, which have posed large losses to largely private Chinese capital, as well as even attacks on Chinese timber companies, which have recently managed to receive a lot of timber concessions from the SAC at extremely low market rates, including some concessions that I think for all apparent purposes are illegal, given that they're in places like national parks, likely why they're also being targeted by actors who are quite upset by what they're observing as support for the Tatmadaw, support for the coup makers. I think one area where you've seen a slightly different picture is in terms of the illicit economy. This is an area where there's actually been a lot of growth. Statistics came out this week about drug seizures in China linked to the Golden Triangle area. There's been a 33.16% increase in arrests, largely related to drug trafficking across the border, as well as a 5.6% increase in seizures. So clearly, narcotics are increasing. Also, with the cross-border fraud and illicit gambling, you've seen a couple of new major zones developing in Wa and Kokong areas. Surprisingly, there's a major crackdown on cross-border communications fraud and illegal gambling cross-border in the border area. But nonetheless, these zones are moving ahead in Kokong and in Wa State, which is an indication, I think, also of there being further growth of the illicit economy, despite some of the Chinese efforts to combat a bit of this. So I think panning out a little bit and looking at some of the bigger picture here and the broader trends, we know that China's official position at this point is to really try to provide the Tatmadaw.
Hi. Yes.
Oh, great.
Good.
Okay.
Apologies, everyone. There are the technical problems have resulted, we believe, from some very bad weather this afternoon that possibly damaged some of the infrastructure that's cables and a tower or something like that. So, Jason, you're back. I'm sorry. If you could pick up where you were cut out on the microphone. Do you remember where
I believe it was just I was about to sum up here with a couple of final points in the bigger picture, but I think really China's official response has been to really both to recognize the SAC as the government in Myanmar, to give kind of full recognition to the SAC, and also to try to create a space where it can work to stabilize the situation. I think while that is maybe the case, a lot of the Chinese investors nonetheless are using high levels of caution in terms of considering some of the official projects. So I think to give an example of that, there's recently been this solar power bid where you've seen just very cold response from potential Chinese investors. And you're also hearing about a reluctance to move forward with any new large projects, particularly over the coming couple of months, given the situation with COVID, and given also, I think, that private Chinese capital that would have maybe invested in things like solar projects or infrastructure is much less willing to do so, just given higher risk assessments and the fact that Chinese companies in particular are being targeted because of the fact that the broader population sees that China is, in fact, coming on the side of supporting the coup. I think that Chinese companies are demanding greater access to security, and this is another thing to keep an eye on. You've seen requests coming in for the operator of the key pipeline project that runs across the country from the coast at Rakhine State up to the Chinese border and then on into China. You've seen efforts to try to increase and enhance security after that project has also come under attack. And I think generally speaking, looking ahead, unless higher levels of stability come about, I think you will see that there's going to be a growing concern on the part of Chinese investors on just how they'll be able to stabilize their projects, given all of the violence and chaos that has been mentioned in some of the earlier presentations. I think, though, the other aspect of this to really keep an eye on is what happens with the illicit economy, because there is a risk that the Tatmadaw will continue to sell off natural resources to some of these illicit capital networks that are deeply involved in that sector. There's the risk that the continuation of some of these conceded. Hello?
Yep, you're back.
Okay, great.
Okay, sorry everybody. Jason, the last few minutes of that was that China, you were saying about the concerns, the overall concerns of China from the recent attacks, etc.
Yeah, so I think that there's high levels of concern. There's been some adjustments in terms of the risk profile of Chinese investments more broadly. So I think that you'll see hesitance on the part of a lot of the state-owned enterprises, as well as some of the Chinese enterprises that would otherwise be involved in development of infrastructure. Chinese finance may also be somewhat concerned to move ahead with large loans on some of these big projects. I think, though, that the SAC will continue to try to woo Chinese investors. So that's one aspect of this to keep an eye on, is just, will there be any consideration of Myanmar's national interest around many of these projects moving forward, or will it simply be kind of transactional, an effort on the part of the SAC to maintain Chinese support by giving better and better deals to some of these companies? And then I think the other thing to look at is the illicit economy, and the fact that you are seeing also this uptick in some of the illegal logging, in extraction of natural resources, and also in these industrial zones that are housing a lot of the casino activities and other illicit activities in Myanmar. And so there's a risk, I think, that illicit actors or the illicit economy will really become the thing that replaces the more formal licit economy kind of looking into the future, and that you'll have a risk of kind of the Tatmadaw establishing some level, not of full control. Obviously, I think you're going to see a long-term picture of violence and chaos kind of into the future, but really transnational criminal actors gaining more and more influence in this economy moving ahead. I know that's a couple of very grim things that I've thrown out there, but I think really the picture with respect to Chinese investment kind of looks a bit like that.
Well, extremely mixed. I mean, what you've drawn is a very, very sort of contradictory position, and I guess you're saying that on one hand, China is sort of pulling out nationals and very nervous of the attacks. On the other hand, it seems determined to go ahead with, these new projects. They must account for at least if the junta is to be believed, they've announced maybe 25 new big projects since the coup. What proportion would you say are Chinese?
Yeah, I would say, some of them are being classified again as being from the UK, but that's really offshore companies. Chinese companies, right, that are based on places like the Cayman Islands or these other sorts of places. So I would say that the large majority of the projects are Chinese. And then I think in terms of where you're seeing projects move ahead, it's really in Rakhine State, where those investors who have some existing projects are moving ahead quickly, and where you have, I think, confidence on the part of investors that they can move ahead, maybe to a little bit of an extent also in the Myanmar border area, where you have seen some of the Chinese companies be quite receptive to the approvals that the Myanmar Investment Commission has given to their projects. And I think in particular, it's been the company that's behind this cross-border economic scheme in Kachin State that has voiced a lot of enthusiasm through its press releases in its ability to move forward with that project now.
Right. Thanks, Jason. We're going to move next to Thompson, but I would just like to reiterate, we are terribly sorry for these technical problems. It does seem that it's beyond our control. The videos will be intact and posted on our YouTube and Facebook sites later. So if you've given up, for those who've given up, if friends are watching, do let people know that the videos will be intact and up on our sites probably later tonight. Turning now to Thompson Chow at Frontier, who is very keyed in on the business sentiment, I think, that we're seeing inside. Thompson, what sort of, apart from this broader question of whether the economy is really on a path to collapse, what are you getting from the companies you speak to often about that very question, and what's your take on the big question?
Thank you, Gwen. I think as you summed up in your introduction, and as Nyanda and Vicky and also Jason touched upon already, the significant challenges and risks remain even as a lot of people in the private sector who intend to return to work have already done so. In Yangon, the traffic is back, and traffic's not helped by all the roadblocks set up by the regime and being slowed down by security checks, but bomb attacks and also shootings have become part of the life in Yangon. I mean, in the area where I'm active in, I mean, there have been quite a few bomb attacks, and even earlier today, there was huge traffic because reportedly one of the military officers was shot in the area. But overall, things have changed significantly since March and April. Shopping malls, restaurants, shops, factories, offices have partially restarted operating over the past month or so. I think when you ask me about what is the response from all the companies, a good indication is a survey undertaken in April by 10 foreign chambers of commerce, which includes, I mean, they have Myanmar members, so that includes a lot of Myanmar companies too. And it's not just Western companies, it also includes the Japanese, the JCC and the Japan Chamber of Commerce in Myanmar. And from the result of more than 300 companies, we see that the top concerns they have is, as other panelists have said already, banking, employee safety, and internet. And I would add, I mean, in terms of employee safety, that is not only about whether people are safe when they go out to the streets, whether they'll be shot or injured. It's also about their security. So, for example, as all of you would already know, my colleague Danny Fenster is still detained. I mean, more than a month when he was trying to board a flight more than a month ago. So, I mean, the fact that senior employees of companies could be detained like that is a matter of great concern in the business community. And of course, moving on in terms of the internet, there was a lot of talk about the draft cybersecurity law, which was quietly shelved, but a lot of the provisions in that draft law was sort of absorbed into other changes in regulations. I think Vicky already mentioned the Electronic Transactions Act. So I think now things have changed again. I mean, a lot of people, at least in Yangon, have internet again. But it remains a concern. I think there's a lack of confidence in how stable the internet connection is. Just at the start of this month, the internet was cut off without much warning, really, for around an hour, presumably because the regime wants to prevent people from watching the online press conference of the National Unity Government. And so, what business people tell me in Yangon is if you cut off the internet like that, it makes business very difficult. It's not purely a human rights issue, it's also a business issue for those. With online meetings, with bank transactions, it made it very difficult with this level of uncertainty. I think looking beyond that, there's a lot of media coverage about Western companies, of course, Kirin as well, and Telenor and Total. But I think the mood in Yangon, even among the Asian conglomerates, a lot of which do not face the same human rights pressure compared to the Western multinationals. But even for them, a lot of them have suspended their construction, their operations. I think the whole situation for them is so unclear that a lot of them, like for example, the Yoma Central in downtown Yangon, the biggest real estate project in Myanmar, they've of course suspended for a year, basically to review whether they should go on and how they should accommodate the new situation. I think another theme that defines the business sentiment in Yangon now is economic desperation. I mean, last week I was in Chinatown. That's one of the small bookstore owners told me that many of the customers have been trying very desperately to return the gold in exchange of cash. And it's the same thing when I talk to local market vendors, street vendors. They said, logistics have largely resumed. So as fruits, rice, crops, there's not much problem in transporting them in most of the city areas. But in terms of customer, they said there's a lot fewer people buying them these days. And if you go to, for example, Junction City, which a lot of it's a shopping mall in downtown Yangon, which again, a lot of shops and restaurants have reopened, but many of them, we don't really see many customers these days. So I think a lot of businesses, big and small, Western and Asian and local, are trying to still perhaps wait a bit more, but trying to assess and prepare for an economy and a market that is a lot less appealing than before. I think I'll also add, in terms of the business environments now, yes, a lot of businesses have reopened, but also I think business people are genuinely concerned about the pressure they're facing. facing. We see media reports about local business leaders being detained, being questioned, but it's beyond that. Even foreign investors and even those backed by Asian governments and Asian companies are not optimistic about the business environment right now. I mean, we saw that all the banks, a lot of the banks are under a very tough position of being forced to reopen. I mean, their staff, supermarket staff, and also journalists being detained. I mean, company licenses of private hospitals and media companies being revoked just like this. So I think that's a genuine worry. I mean, according to my knowledge, for example, I mean, Tilawa Special Economic Zone in Yangon, that was President Deng Xiaoping's sort of crown project. My understanding is that the new SEZ chairman appointed by the regime and his people were sort of visiting around, knocking on the factories and asking questions about CDM and whether they've resumed operations. So I think there's a huge concern in the business community that all these questions are being asked and inquiries being made. And I think businesses do not want to be used by the regime as a demonstration that the economy is back and things are going back to normal, they're succeeding. So I think there's a genuine reluctance and concern of being used that way. Of course, earlier I talked about bomb attacks, mostly targeted against families and associates of the regime, the military regime, and of course shootings as well. In Yangon, in broad daylight, we no longer see the sort of shooting frenzy that we saw in March on Armed Forces Day, in Lantaya in early March. We no longer see that. But I think a lot of protesters and even business people have said the crackdown have changed to a more covert form of arrest and detainment and of detention and even of torture. A few business executives have also told me they are worried that Yangon or elsewhere in Myanmar would end up like Belfast, referring to the frequent bomb attacks affecting the whole stability of the city. I think building on what Vicky and others have said earlier, I think it's quite split here. I think a lot of business, particularly Western ones and Japanese ones, have basically said, they're quite bleak about prospects. That some of the locals and Asian companies are basically waiting and hoping that once the shooting, once the disruption is over, once the chaos is over, they could go back to try to do as much business as possible. But I think even if you take a step back, away from all these, what's happening now with in the streets, I think in terms of policies, we see the business environment is nothing positive for all of the business people I've spoken to. We talked already about the cybersecurity regulations, which would make things very difficult for investors in the whole digital world. It's not only Telenor, it's also about e-commerce, food delivery service apps, and all those. We talked about, there's one thing that strikes me is the decline of transparency in the Myanmar Investment Commission. They no longer publish investment proposals, investment approvals, like what was done. Under the NLD government, they would publish all the approvals by the MIC. So there's a general decline in transparency, and it's sort of what is seen as a setback in progress in economic reform. I think Jason also mentioned the solar tender. Even if you remove all the political instability and the whole crisis, in the tender itself, nothing much has changed really compared to last year's solar tender, which was very controversial, which triggered a big backlash in the business community. In terms of the timeline, the tender window, the land acquisition requirement, nothing really has changed. I think Jason also mentioned that Chinese bidders are now quite reluctant to take part in this tender. So I think on that we will see how it goes. I think the tender's deadline is in August, so we'll know by then how keen the Chinese or even other Asian investors are. I think my last point quickly to add is that I think Vicky's presentation mentioned the NUG and the democracy movement and the position on various business issues. I think it's getting clearer now what the democracy movement wants, what CDM wants, and what NUG wants. I think they've said in public, according to publicly available information, I think there's three differentiation. One is those companies who were who struck deals with either the Thein Sein or the Aung San Suu Kyi administration and are now forced to comply because they are, the SAC is now the de facto authority. And I think this, they say, is understandable. And they also, I think one of them also in the media named Talent, saying that it's understandable they have to comply with the regime's censorship orders. But I think two particular concerns right now that would not go away is the new deals, the new investments who are now being approved by the new regime, as well as those companies who are doing business with military companies. So I think, for example, Kirin, they struck the deal long ago, but it doesn't make a difference. And there's still a lot of pressure for them to pull out. I think also when Nikkei Asia also reported Hong Kong listed B Power, Shangri-La, Indian Adani, and they are still doing business with the military companies. So I think public pressure on them, both internationally in terms of sanctions and media scrutiny, and domestically in terms of boycotts and calling them out, this will not go away. I don't think this will go away anytime soon. So I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Oh, Thompson, excellent. Thank you very much. We've got some questions coming in. We'll come back to, I think some of those issues are very key, actually. And I just want to move on to Ardith, who is sitting in Boston and has also a couple of slides. Can I just also say, though, again to viewers, we will have the videos intact. If you want to ask questions, please post them. And Ardith, over to you, your take on where we're at. You've done a lot of interesting research on the state of everyday life since the coup. So over to you.
Thank you, Gwen. So I just want to mainly respond to your questions about, how things are going, right? What's the prospect? What's the economic prospect in the country? So I said that how things are going to get worse for all the reasons that our panelists have covered. But how worse things are going to be will depend very much on the evolving political situations in specific regions and how the military will respond to economic crisis caused by political instability and this third wave of COVID. So the coup has had a negative impact on everyone. But what I want to show here is that the level and severity of economic crisis vary depending on the political situations of specific regions, as well as the existing economy of the region, the nature of individual occupations, socio-economic class, compositions of the households, and the availability of coping strategies that individuals are able to use to deal with the crisis. So just want to give you a sense of how the situations vary across the country. And this chart, this is work in progress, but it shows a wide range of political situations which are displayed and aggregated at the state and regional level. So it's very generalized. And this, since the coup occurred in February, and it, again, this is work in progress, but it shows, a wide range of situations which varies from a relatively peaceful areas, I would not call peaceful, I would say new normal, right? Different types of normal situations expressed in blue and green colors to a high level of violence areas. So regions that experience higher level of violence and political instability tend to have one or combinations of the factors. So they are either, NLD strongholds and have access to weapons. So this could be in areas controlled by armed groups or remote areas that are still using, hunting and handguns, handmade guns, and places that are able to launch offensive against the military and ability to inflict casualties and damages. So populations that are currently displaced with very limited access to food and medicines, such as various parts of Kachin State, Karen State, Kaya, Bago, Sagaing region, Magui, Mindat and Chin State are from those very most vulnerable and affected areas. On the other hand, residents that are composed of, overwhelmingly of the military supporters or regions that were not able to resist strongly or that were not able to launch major offensives against the military tend to experience lower level of violence and relatively more stable economic situations. We should, however, note that the examples of these places are, generally Mon State, Rakhine State, the Nintara region, and Yangon. And it's important to know, and this is, regardless. So I'm describing the situations in relative term. Because our panelists have already talked about, targeted assassinations and explosions in various places across the country. It's important to know, however, that people from relatively more stable, politically stable areas do not necessarily have better economic situations. For instance, is Rakhine State, which is one of the poorest region in the country, but it has remained relatively peaceful, but it's economically affected as well because they export a lot of products that are originated in mainland Burma, which is being affected by the crisis that we have talked about. Rural areas tend to fare relatively better than urban areas, which have served as a site of strong resistance against the military. Since the coup, there has been a reverse trend of populations movement. We've seen in rural areas, we have seen a growing number of people returning from the cities. They are made up of mostly young people who lost their job in factories, constructions, and service sectors in the cities. They have been absorbed by their families, and at present in various parts of the rural areas that depend on agriculture, we see that there are some limited jobs, right, and not as well paid as they would be getting in the cities, but there are still some odd jobs available because of the harvesting and planting agriculture seasons. Small, medium land-owning farmers are less affected than landless and daily wagers who have to buy food. Many farmers have barely regained their investment from the previous harvest. Nathan has already talked about that because of the decline in the prices of their crops. But I would say that farmers' situations vary depending on the crops that they grow. For instance, most of the sesame farmers have lost their money or barely recovered their investment because of the decline in prices in their crops due to import restrictions by China and Japan, partly because of the coup and partly also because of COVID-related restrictions. Whereas you see that beans and pulse farmers who produce beans and pulses are able to gain more due to increased exports of beans to India. I would say the most affected people in the country are factory workers and people who engage in civil disobedience movement, who have lost
I'm assuming that's what
their... Yeah. Oh, you couldn't hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I heard something. So.
No, keep going. You can cut in and out if you want and just talk or show the slides occasionally. Or
Okay. Most affected people are factories workers and CDM who have completely lost their jobs. A majority people such as daily wagers, traders, small shop operators, staff who work for hotel, transport, sale have now returned to work, and this is across the country, albeit with reduced hours and wages. In terms of household, the household that have younger and able-bodied members are able to cope better than those that have elderly, dependent children and female households. Lower income groups have less available coping strategies, and they tend to focus more on survival and making ends meet. The ability to deal with economic crisis depends on their socioeconomic status, their occupations, the numbers and nature of household, as well as places of residence. So people from lower income have fewer options, and they have cut down on expenses. They share resources among the families. They rely more on resources that are available in the environment. They borrow, they beg. We have seen many people, growing number of people begging on the street, going door to door, asking for money. Some people just stop paying their loans, and those are all these macro data are already available. Or some people switch or are looking for new jobs. So looking for new jobs is more common among the CDM who have no prospect of returning back to their original job. And this is a little bit different from factory workers who see their situations as temporary, and who are working, either not doing anything or doing some odd jobs and waiting for their factories to reopen. Farmers are now using less fertilizer, and they are relying more on the family labor to cut costs. And some of the vulnerable communities are able to rely on assistance from the community, the neighborhood, and some non-profit organizations. But the role of non-profit organizations, community-based organizations, have significantly reduced due to political recession. So this is something that is different in the past, and it's really a concern for the
correct.
Yes, for a very concerning trend that is happening right now. All small, medium business cut down on their employees. They reduce working hours or the salaries of their employees. They rely on family labor. However, what's interesting is that middle and upper class members of the society are relatively affected, are even able to take advantage of the situations, especially those who have capital, have been able to expand their income by charging 10 to 12% to provide cash to those who are unable to withdraw money from the bank by accepting their bank transfer payments. They're buying more land and gold and dollars, and that's why you see that prices of land and gold have increased in the countries. Others take advantage of the state's lack of capacity to enforce law by extracting, natural resources, timber, gold, or are engaging in illegal gambling. So, Jason talks about transnational crime and gambling, but I'm talking about local level, small scale gambling that have increased throughout the country. And across the country, we have seen that corruptions have increased, partly due to the lack of state capacity, as well as because of the disappearance of channels for people to complain, which existed in the previous under the previous civilian government. So in the end, I just want to stress that livelihood, security, and welfare of individuals and households will very much depend on evolving political situations, which will very much determined by the interactions between pro-military and anti-military forces, and that also includes, economic sanctions imposed by Western countries and pressure by diaspora. Nyenta mentioned something about, the explosions targeted assassination of administrative leaders at the township level. That could get worse, or that could be brought under control. We don't know. We really don't know how these political situations will evolve in several places, because every second, every minute, things have changed, right? So it's not just the Damodar that is able to control everything, but it's just interactions between the two forces. So the situation, just to reiterate what I have said at the beginning, situations will get worse, but how worse it gets will very much depend, will vary across the regions, across sectors, across occupations and socio-economic classes. Thank you.
Ada, thank you very much for that. Obviously, that's a very interesting research project, and as you continue, I think we'd all be very interested in the final results of that. How comprehensive is your research on all this at the moment? How many regions or states and areas are you questioning people in?
I'm looking at all 14 states and regions, and I'm looking at 2 townships per state and region. So
Right.
It's more of qualitative research rather than quantitative research.
Right. And are you doing it through researchers, telephones, internet?
Something like that, but I don't want to
Sure.
talk much about this because of the security and safety of my.
Got you on that. Just wanted to see they're great insights. So thanks for that. So actually, we've got quite a few questions, and thank you, people, for sticking with us. I'm very heartened to see how many people put up with the long interruptions, and so I feel compelled to address everybody's questions because they have been very patient with our technical problems. Some overlap, so I thought what I might do is just read out the questions we've got, and I think we can address them. We don't have enough time, I think, for everybody to answer every question, but I'm going to read them out and then perhaps begin with the last one. So a question from Julian Pianzazek. A lot of people would really like to know how much the negative business conditions are impacting the junta, the SAC and the Tatmadaw. And that overlaps with a couple of other questions. Another one is from Jeremy Cruz. Is CDM, the civil disobedience movement, actually having a major impact on economic activity? I know all of you have got some insight on that. From Phil Sherwell, Sunday Times, for all panellists in Myanmar, what is the current status and impact of CDM? That's the similar question, so I think that could combine. From Mary Callahan, what happens when the next natural disaster, a flood or cyclone, happens and businesses are preyed on for donations? How can businesses say no to the SAC? I actually think that's a very fine example of the dilemma that businesses are actually in. How do you say no to the SAC for anything if they're asking you to, for example, build a wall in Rakhine or something like that? So I think that could combine with the dilemma for businesses. Jeremy Cruz asks again, what is the impact of Western sanctions on business? And from Phil Robertson, Human Rights Watch, and my colleague who has been patiently monitoring these questions over Facebook, asks, many say that sanctions on oil and gas revenues will have a major impact if they are implemented, especially cutting off revenue from the big oil and gas majors, PTT, Total and Chevron. What's the assessment of some of you panellists who have looked at this question close up? I know you have, Vicky, and you, Thompson. And then from Roman Caillot, consultant and big Myanmar expert, to all panellists, are you seeing certain domestic businesses seeking to curry favour with the SAC and positioning themselves as the would-be cronies in the emerging political economy? Or do you assess that SAC is isolated from the domestic business community? So I think you've touched a little bit on these issues, Vicky and Thompson. You might also have some insights, others on the panel. Also, from Phil Sherwell, would be interested to hear opinions on the role of Russia as an increasingly important business partner for the SAC. So I would suggest that perhaps we could start with... I've also got one more from Dominic Wu, journalist, for Thompson and Vicky. What leverage do businesses have under the regime, even as some big names and foreign chambers have spoken out against junta policies and violence? Is it defensible for many businesses to remain silent? Protesters see them as sitting on the fence and waiting to go back to embrace business as usual. That's not a good profile for a company. So perhaps I think we could start with that and come for there is finally one more I'd like to throw in from Titinan Pongsudirak, the director of the Institute for Security and International Studies at Chulalongkorn University. How high is the likelihood of a coup within a coup to remove Min Aung Hlaing and return to dialogue, and the likelihood of the Tatmadaw prevailing at harsh cost in the medium term? So actually we have mainly talked about economies, so perhaps we could perhaps shift a little bit to politics, if any of you would like to comment on the likelihood of a coup within a coup, particularly, I suppose, aimed at removing the current leadership. Is there any... that would possibly feed into the question of how unified is the military? I can see you all falling over yourselves to answer that. Jason, you've been looking a little bit at the situation in the countryside and some of the regions, and wonder if you have a view on that. States, rather, I mean.
You're talking specifically about the last question on the coup within a coup?
Yeah.
Where my take on that is it's highly unlikely. I don't really see a scenario emerging where other members of the military would aim to try to topple or take down Min Aung Hlaing. If that were to happen, I would imagine that the scenario that you would get would be probably even worse, because you would then have kind of a new military leader who would have to somehow think about the even bigger setback now that it sent a signal to the rest of the world that the Tatmadaw doesn't even have its house in order amongst the top leadership. And I think that is a sign of just extreme instability. So I think the likelihood of that is pretty low.
Right. Any of the others have an opinion on that? No? Let's just move along. Vicky, yeah.
I'll say one thing. I mean, I think Jason is probably right, and I think we should also just...
Could you speak up a little bit?
Yeah. So I think I more or less agree with Jason, and I think we should also look at history. So if we look at previous coups and attempted coups, the only one I can think of where really the top guy was pushed off his perch was when Saw Maung was sent away to retire. And that was through some fairly bizarre behaviour. I think it was felt by his colleagues that he couldn't continue in his position. Any other sort of putches have more been from the top down, like the putsch against military intelligence. So there's not really a history of people from below pushing out number one, except in the case of Saw Maung that I'm aware of.
Right. Even though I suppose by most of our interpretations, the behaviour of the current junta chief is bizarre by any normal standards, maybe not so much in Tatmadaw terms. Yes?
Sorry.
Sorry. Even if there is a counter coup, we're not sure whether the situations would be better or for worse, because at the very at the earlier period of the coup, there were some segments within the military who were not very happy with how Myanmar Online was handling with the situations, the evolving situations. They did not think that Myanmar Online was tough enough. So we should also keep in mind that, even if, right, I agree with Jason and Vicky that the likelihood is very low, but even if there is a situation of counter coup,
it's not going to be any better. Mm.
Right.
Right. And Nyanta, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I slightly disagree. And in the sentiment, and the reason is, if we talk about history, there are very, very few instances, because there are very few successful instances, right? It's not that there hasn't been challenges to the role or authority of past commanders-in-chief. And you have a situation here where, let's be frank, this is a coup with not much moral authority. In the manner in which it was conducted, whatever the reason was, has been publicly given at the level of the politico and the even within the elites of the military. There are, I think, reasonable doubts and concerns about whether it was justified, and the manner in which it was undertaken, right, in breach, as I would argue, of the military's own constitution. The position it's put the country in, I think, has also threatened the old guard, if we are going to be quite frank. It's threatened the security, the immunity, I think, the shared prosperity that we've seen over the past decade. And it's put the country on a very uncertain path, I think much more so than any time in recent history. To have the scale of daily attacks and bombings coming into the Central Valley, into cities. This is no small, I think, challenge to authority. So it doesn't mean the chances of a coup, therefore, are high, but they're not low either. If there's been any time in the history of the military where you would question the chosen path by leadership, I think this certainly is such an instant. And
do you think, like Ardith, that it could only be a worst case, no worse?
Yeah. Quite. I mean, we're getting into the weeds here, but I think it depends on who of the personalities within the top, 12, 15, 20 individuals, would consider such a move. This is all very theoretical, right?
Right.
Okay. But my point is more about sentiment. It's I think it's a little bit unsettling.
Right.
If you are a long-time serving officer, right, and to be seeing the country put through, this kind of situation. Okay. I think that's a dynamic that's a narrative that's often ignored. Doesn't come out. This right. coup lacks legitimacy across multiple dimensions, including right. within the military, including in the self-conception, right, of the military as the so-called guardian of the state. And I think the confluence of these factors, we have no idea how they will play out. They are obvious. I think if there's any such decision, it's people are going to ride the tide, right? So it's a little bit early to say which way the tide is flowing.
Right. Thanks. So it's the politician's line that you wouldn't rule it out. Right. So let's move on to Phil Robertson's question about sanctions on oil and gas revenues. I do agree that it is constantly coming back up, even though we've seen strings of sanctions rolled out by a variety of Western countries, and even, every few days some other company is added, some gem seller, some timber company. But really, the bottom line, we keep hearing that the oil and gas, the government-owned, the state-owned MOGE, Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, is the big one. If major sanctions on oil and gas revenues are implemented, what would be the impact, especially cutting off revenue from the big ones, PTT, Total, Chevron? Thompson, you've done a fair bit on sanctions. Do you think that's the main thing? Would that possibly...
I mean, if that happens, of course, it would be a main source of concern for everyone here, not only the business community. But I think from discussions I have with diplomats and people in town, I think they do not think a sanction on MOG is likely at this stage.
Right. So it could be impactful, but not likely. Vicky, what's your view?
And I think...
Sorry.
Overall, on the question of Western sanctions, it is something that people are looking at. But as we have said, I mean, there's so many things happening right now. So I think most business people, if you're a factory manager, if you are an investor, you would be a lot more concerned about survival and the staff's safety right now than any further sanctions or future sanctions.
Right. Vicky?
I mean, I think if you put MOGE...
Could you put your microphone up a bit more?
Sorry, yeah. I think if you put MOGE on sanctions lists, that doesn't necessarily achieve what people want to do. And I know that some of the NGOs looking at this have been looking at the sort of different channels and flows of funds, and obviously purchases of gas and payments to MOGE in Thailand, in Bangkok are a key part of that. That's actually where one would need to hit to stop those flows going. So effectively, then you'd be sanctioning potentially banks from Thailand, which I'm not sure whether EU or US or others are willing to do that. But I mean, assuming that one found that magic bullet to do that, I think then the next step would be what would be the reaction of the regime. Would they? I mean, what the comeback from groups is always, well, we're just asking you to put money in escrow account. So, for example, what would be the reaction of the regime to Total, Chevron, POSCO? Because it's only going to be, frankly, the Western ones. It's not ever going to be PTTEP putting money into an escrow account. What would be the reaction of that? It would be a breach of contract. Would the military kick Total out? We've got three more years or so to run on the field. The one who cares most about it is PTTEP. Would they say breach of contract,
right?
End of Total, PTT come in and man the pumps,
right?
So I don't think this is kind of straightforward, but I think then there's also the question of how does the military operate and get funding. And an awful lot of what it does is, particularly at the level of payments of salaries and wages, is living off the land. And we've seen that in spades over the last few months. You just see it on all the CCTV cameras as the soldiers are out there on the streets raiding shops, and we hear from all our friends of mobile phones being taken at checkpoints and so on. So at that level, that's the way that the troops are starting to be, funded and fed. And at the upper level, as Jason alluded to, there's potential for more illegal business dealing, which again is a nice side earner for the more senior level people. It's always been a hierarchy very much based on those patronage opportunities. Now, what about the arms purchases, which is what people are worried about?
Vicky, could you speak a little louder? I think we've had some... Yeah, that's better. Yeah. We did have some comments that people couldn't hear you.
Okay, so I mean, arms purchases, and obviously the main arms sellers right now are the Russians and Chinese. How much of that can be done on credit? I would say that the Chinese are usually a bit more open to credit than the Russians are. The Russians like cash. Yeah, I don't know, but I think that finding a magic bullet related to oil and gas revenue isn't straightforward, particularly when you have very keen buyers at the end of the two pipelines to Thailand and to China.
Right. So you're saying it's unlikely that they would such major sanctions would go ahead, but also even if they did, there are ways the junta could get around and buy, its big hardware, toys and things on credit. Is that what you're saying?
No, I didn't say it was unlikely sanctions would go ahead. I think that was more Thompson's point.
Right.
What I was saying is it's not necessarily the magic bullet. It might be one of those things, a bit like not printing banknotes, which
right.
causes an immediate and then a solution is found.
Yeah. Speaking of banknotes, could I just riff off that, because there was someone asking about the chat and banknote printing and whether there's evidence of that now. And it's hard to tell. Inflation is clearly kicking in. And Ardith, you've probably seen some evidence of that, and we've heard a lot about rising prices. But do you think there's a money printing that is also having an impact inside?
I think at this point, no, because if it was the case, then we wouldn't have these major cash shortages in banks, because clearly this is a matter of concern to Central Bank of Myanmar, hence the rationing. So if they were really pressing the button successfully on the printing presses, then that wouldn't be the major problem. And as I think I said earlier in my presentation, the expectation, though, is that they are going to be starting to print in order to fund the agricultural loans that will be given out under Myanmar Agricultural Development Bank. And the figures that have been mentioned there are 1.3 trillion chats. Now, I can't remember how much that calculates as in real money. And obviously that amount goes down as the chat devalues. But that's the expectation, as I said, is that there will be more cash coming into the economy for that. Now, whether that then becomes a habit, I think, again, unclear. There are plenty of rumours around that there will be 20,000 chat notes, 50,000 chat notes. Right. But we don't know yet. Right.
Thompson, you're looking like you might want to say, so you've done a bit of work on this too. There are some reports of a lot of evidence of printed new money that you mentioned, Vicky, that the German company had stopped supplying. So I guess there are new bills being printed on with new, who knows, might be paper from North Korea or China, or do you know, Jason? Is it Chinese? Okay. So there was the question about Russia as well as an emerging new business partner. And then I'd like to turn to a couple of these very interesting questions about the dilemma for business. In your assessment, Jason, of looking at the Russia connection, you also have been looking a bit at Russia, the China connection, You've also been looking at Russia. Do you have a view on the emergence of Russia as a...
Yeah, we had heard about this steel factory, right, that was going to be restarted, sort of a historical project that was a total disaster that may somehow suddenly now be put back on the docket, sort of in the post-coup environment. But I don't really see Russia kind of coming in with major investments in the country. It just... given distance, given, connectivities of the Russian economy, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense for there to be a sudden explosion of Russian investment. I would be a bit surprised to see that, and I think it's probably going to be the case that it would still be Chinese companies, Thai companies, maybe Indian companies as well that would continue to express interest in investments in Myanmar. But I don't really see, maybe others who have looked more closely at right. Russian business than I have would have a difference of opinion, but I don't really see where outside of perhaps the arms and weapons, which right. are certainly going to continue to be relevant, where you're going to see a large number of other Russian investors coming
right.
in.
So, Vicky, you haven't had any Russian companies rushing to sign your responsible business petition?
But that's because there really aren't. I think we need to make a big distinction here between the things that Russia wants to sell to Myanmar and Russian investors. And there are next to no Russian investors in Myanmar right now, and that has been the case for the last for the last forever, really, basically. We have Bashneft exploring onshore,
well, and the revival of the steel plant in Shan State, right?
And then the steel plant in Shan State, which dates back, this is over 15 years old. No, over 15 years old. And the plan was, when it was first being designed, was that this was going to be a showcase of Russian steel technology that they were then going to be using to flog that to Kazakhstan and other countries. So it's proven to be a disaster from the Russian perspective. And eventually the NLD government pulled the plug on it because they didn't see that it was going to be economically competitive compared to having imported steel. This was part of a historical decision by the SPDC to go out and start investing in steel plants because they felt that sanctions, this was kind of 2007, 8, 9, were going to impact on their ability to have steel. So again, a slightly sort of confused logic to it economically in the first place. But basically what we're looking at with Russia is a sales relationship, and that sales are weapons, including technology weapons as well. Right. And that's partly a reflection of the 5,000 or so Tatmadaw soldiers who trained in Russia over the last 10 to 15 years.
Right.
There's a kinship there, the language, there are links.
It's a very good point. And I do think the steel mill also feeds into the new rhetoric we've seen since February the 1st and Min Aung Hlaing's obsession with this, self-sufficiency and xenophobia and determination to wean the country off imports of any sort. So you can bet your life we're going to see some very sort of poor steel being produced if they manage to crank the steel mill up at all. But I'd like to also introduce one question which I think also, all of you would have a view, but maybe Ardith and Nyanta with your insights into on-the-ground situation from Leong Wei Yin from CNA, I think. How is this coup situation going to end? With planned elections happening in 2 years, so even if elections are going to be held, we can be sure the junta will go all out to ensure victory. So are people going to accept results, or will CDM continue? That is looking 2 years down the track, if even Min Aung Hlaing stuck to his promise to hold the elections, and even if people would tolerate the inevitable dismantling of the NLD in those kind of elections. Ardith, you've been doing some research on the ground and have some idea of sentiment. Do you think people take any prospect of elections in 2 years seriously?
Well, there are some political parties, right? Over 20 some political parties which have contested the results of the elections, claiming that NLD allegedly engaged in vote fraud. So there are some political parties that are going to compete if there were elections. The entire situation is just like a deja vu moment for me. It's like bringing us back to 1990 situations, in the 1990s, where the military tried to, have elections, and so to me, it's almost like going to be a repetition of the history back in 1990s, 2000s period. So. But the question is, to what extent people are going to vote in the elections or participate in the elections. So if they are not going out to vote, then it's most likely that the regime's party is going to definitely win, right? So there has been a lot of ongoing debate about among the political parties, which are already thinking about whether they should participate in the elections because they feel like it's a deadlock situation right now, and the only ways in which they can help improve the situation is to join the system by and then try to make incremental changes within the system. So we're not sure when this election is going to be held, but it's very difficult to predict. But I like to talk a little bit about the impact of CDM. somebody mentioned that, and it's really difficult to isolate the impact of CDM movement on the economy, because you have to look at it through sectors, right? Different sectors, and in some sectors, they are hurting general populations more than they're hurting the military. So I also, do they have an impact on the economy? Yes, but it's also difficult to isolate the impact of CDM movement from, political instability caused by, the military repressions or caused by armed fighting. So to some extent, CDM movement was able to weaken the government's day-to-day operations. But to some extent, I'm really concerned about the health crisis now. And it's, COVID situation is going to get worse. And the research findings that I talk about, I was not looking at the COVID situation, but the concerning trend, however, is that in many places, there were government orders and regulations about, stay home or wearing masks and things like that. But these exist only on paper. People just neglected these restrictions. So, and we don't really know the rate of, the spread, but it's going to be worse because of the CDM movement by healthcare professions. So I would say that it's, maybe education sector is a little bit different, right? So when we talk about the CDM movement, it's more important to talk about, the general, the overall impact of different sectors and, who get hurt more than others. At current situations, the CDM people themselves are highly vulnerable, and in the high-risk populations, they're concerned about their safety, and they lost their employments. And when you look at the applications by the government to fill the positions that have been vacated by the CDM, government received more applications than the vacancy, and plus in some situations there are even some bribery by people to get the job. So because we know that there is a dissatisfactions and people are angry at the military. They're not happy at the military, but at some point they have to go back and work, right? There's immediate economic concerns that they have to survive. So so I would say that it's really difficult to isolate the impact of to talk about the general impact of CDM movement. We have to look at by sector.
Right. Thanks. That's a very good point. And Jason, you wanted to comment on the election situation, I think.
Yeah, just coming back on elections, I think a couple of things. I mean, first of all, is that you've seen kind of a erosion of any level of administrative functions under the State Administrative Council, particularly in a lot of the ethnic areas. So I think that's going to make it harder and harder to organize elections in many of those areas. Of course, you also have stronger resistance from the KA, the KNU, KNPP. You have all of these PDFs that are popping up all over the country. So I think
People's Defense Forces, yeah.
These People's Defense Forces that are popping up all over the country. So I think that's also going to make it extremely difficult to organize elections. I mean, even if we're talking about 2 years out, as those plans become more clear, I think that's going to further cause stronger sentiment against the military as it tries to orchestrate that, and probably elections offices would again likely become targets. So I just don't really see where there would be the administrative capacity to do elections. And then beyond that, I mean, just securing participation, I think, would be difficult. Of course, there are places where you have voter turnouts that are much larger than the overall population, highly orchestrated elections. But I think you're going to see high levels of resistance in any election that's organized by the SAC.
Right, that's a very good point too. Actually, I'd like to end. I think we've got so many great questions, but I'd like to end on. There's a couple of related questions which I think really make a good point. This is from Jeremy Cruz, who asked several others. Sorry, Jeremy, couldn't get to the other two. But would economic collapse actually be a more likely driver to force the junta, the SAC, to rethink than pressure from armed groups, or I presume from, others? There is that scenario. If we're talking about, and some of the things I think some of you are saying tonight would suggest that the economic collapse scenario is not out of the question, even though we're also talking about an emerging new normal that's maybe very dysfunctional kind of new normal. So, are we sort of really factoring in the whole complete collapse situation? I guess those of us who look back at the dark days after 88 might have seen things were pretty bad back then, right? And I don't think Myanmar's, despite the violence and the economic paralysis and the banking crisis, I can't see that it's actually as bad as it was back then. But I think we've got some veterans up there who can say that. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think...
I'll go first. I don't believe that economic collapse drives a change of heart in...
Can you just put that mic near you?
Sorry. I don't believe in the theory that economic collapse drives a change of heart in the government, at least not in the short term. I mean, again, looking at history, one could argue that one of the drivers for change was a sense of, on the part of the military, of reliance on China. I think that's real, but that took 15 years to develop. And in the meantime, the military was pursuing, bad economic policies, which fundamentally were retarding Myanmar's economy. So it's not that it's motivated by economic collapse. It usually helps contribute to it. I always feel there's sort of two schools of thought in Myanmar political movements, one of which is always looking for the last straw that will break the camel's back, and the other of which was more looking for strengthening the people and their ability to survive and push back. I'm on the second school, in case you haven't worked that one out.
Right, thanks, Vicky. Nyanta, you've got an expression on your face. What's your view of the economic collapse scenario?
Rather than that question, I think maybe a better framing is to think about where the SAC's thinking is.
Where the SAC, what?
Their thinking.
Right.
And what I mean is the strategy from everything we're seeing remains unchanged since February 1st, right? There's still this notion that all we've got to do is to normalize, to calm things down, pledge the stabilization of the economy, or pledge elections. I think he has every intention. I think the Commander-in-Chief has every intention of running elections were he given the chance. But the criteria to be able to run such elections, I think, as Jason and others have pointed out, are going to be quite difficult to meet. Not to mention the fact that we had elections, the general public and others perceive them as legitimate. We have the results. We have elected officials. They are active, and they will continue to contest, right? So in that dynamic, there's still no indication that they are, adapting to or reassessing their position and responding to the multiple threats, economic threats, but also political threats, armed threats, and others. So that, for me, is the more, I think, worrisome facet of where we are right now. And if there isn't that adjustment, if there is still, is that because of imperfect information? Is that because of sheer bluster and confidence in the current strategy? Is that rational? These, I think, are the more important questions. And I think What will be interesting is when there is a perceived need to adapt, when they reach that point, and the trigger for that, or triggers for that, may be any number of things. It can be the continued escalation of violence. It can be food supply chains beginning to affect not just the general population, but also an organization that still has to sit within society.
Right.
They live in a society, I think is a good way to put it. They currently sit above it, but at some point, the effects that impact the general population do bound or rebound back up to those in power. So when that, I think, those effects become more apparent, I think that's when we can say this or that. I'll stop here.
Right. Thank you. Going back to that question, if it's not going to be economic collapse that would force a rethink by the junta, the SAC, would it then be pressure, CDM, ethnic armed organisations, a combination of popular resistance and armed opposition? Ardith, you're looking very sceptical. I mean...
I think if anything happens, it's because of a combination of so many factors, right? It could be economic crisis, and what caused economic crisis? It's caused by political pressure. So I don't think that we will be able to just look at separately and isolate the effect of particular factors. And also my other armed groups is so diverse. Armed groups are so diverse. You have armed groups that are not doing anything, that maintain the neutral position. You have armed groups that are actively fighting the government, and you have armed groups that are, support the military regime. So it's also, armed groups are divided among them. Ethnic armed groups are divided. So that's also, it's really difficult to predict. And their policy change almost every day.
Right.
My other question is, what are the what are the indicators that say that the economy has collapsed? I thought the economy has already collapsed, right? So to what extent, right? The question is like, to what extent and our calculation, if we see the economy has collapsed, maybe the military will not necessarily see the same, right? Sometimes their calculations, their perceptions is completely different and isolated from what the rest of the world thinks. So it's, I would say that if any changes happen, it's just a combination of so many factors that are going on. And I think that the opposition, members of the oppositions are pretty much aware of this, and they believe in, in engaging in multifaceted pressures to put pressure on the military.
Right. Thanks. I think that was a very wise insight there. Reminds us. Thompson, over to you. These are the closing remarks. We'll then turn to Jason. Economic collapse, other factors that might force I know you also have done a lot of work on business and business sentiment. Do you think perhaps we could add into the mix if, this current exodus of Western business, if that continues, and if, in Jason's point, that Chinese business is getting extremely...
Gwen, can I just jump in on that? I don't see a current exodus
Sorry,
of
we
Western
can't...
business. Sorry, I don't honestly see a current exodus of Western business.
Right.
I see hibernation. I see some decisions by Western garment brands like Benetton not to buy. But, Heineken, Total, Telenor, they're still there. Now, whether there will be an exodus in future, I don't know, but there really isn't a current exodus of Western business right now. And I think, as I said in my presentation, it's more likely to be driven by deterioration in the operating economy in terms of corruption and things like that, to the point that they feel they can no longer fairly operate.
Right, I see.
Sorry to interrupt.
So in that case, you think it's hibernation, that most of the Western chambers are reporting huge reductions in membership. In other words, like the members have gone, cancelled, withdrawn. I think, Thompson, you've done a bit of work on that. So
can I just add?
Are you suggesting that they're in hibernation? Yes, now to go
just
on.
to tag onto Vicky's point,
Yeah.
which I agree with. what maybe we're missing is an assessment of the flight of local capital, right? So in the periods in the late 80s, early 90s, there was no local capital. We were just transitioning from what was essentially a centrally controlled socialist economy to a market economy back then. So, any kind of private wealth would have been negligible at that point in time. The past decade, and of course the preceding years, even under a past junta rule, did create wealth. And is that wealth, I think it's a rhetorical question. What happens when that wealth fleets, that local capital?
Right. Okay. That's a good question. Thompson, you want to answer? And your view was, I think, that there is, maybe that's a hibernation, but the big reductions in memberships in the chambers of commerce.
I think to build on what Vicky and almost everyone has talked about, I think a lot of companies still suspending and waiting and see.
Could you speak up a little bit too? You're not very clear.
Oh, sure. I think a lot of them are trying to wait and see. I think a lot of them are suspended. They haven't decided to pull out yet. For example, Telenor, they impaired the whole $780 million investment here, but it doesn't mean they're pulling out. One of the senior Western diplomats in Yangon recently told me, I think to return to the question about economic collapse, he told me, look, if the SAC cares about economic collapse and suffering, they would have a rethink way earlier. The Fitch Solutions is forecasting, predicted a 20% collapse of the whole economy. So if they really cared, they would have. And if they cared about collapse and suffering, they would be more concerned about the cash shortage, which is the real concern in Yangon, than asking banks to submit customer information of ATM withdrawals. So I think it's very clear where their priorities lie. But I think building on that, I think there's a key difference between whether the SAC, the regime, cares about economic collapse and whether they care about business advocacy. I think everyone has read the statement facilitated by Vicky's Myanmar Center for Responsible Business and joint statements by Western chambers. But I think, out there are a lot of activists, even the UN, Tom Andrews talks about leverage. Companies need to exert leverage on the regime, against the regime, and push back. Being in Yangon, I feel a lot of that leverage is undermined and business have their wing clipped simply because most of the business people here, most of the business community are not doing anything at all. Western chambers, I'm sorry, but they are a minority. Where are the Chinese? Where are the Thais? Where are the Hong Kongs? So I think I'll end by saying I'm surprised for the business community. You guys do have some sort of leverage if you can muscle together and speak up and speak out on a range of from policies to violence. I think many people here do think the regime would respond if the Chinese and the Thais tell them, hold on a minute, you can't do that. We can't function, we can't go online. So I think the key right now looking at, Jason mentioned about the reaction of Chinese companies. We talked about the reaction of the Russians and Western people. So I think right now it really depends on the rest of all the Asian conglomerates. Kieran is not the only one who is in that with military. You have a few Hong Kong conglomerates and Adani, and they have said, I'm sorry, but they haven't said anything. Some of them have said nothing.
And what's your impression of what proportion of, if we're talking about, obviously the big Western names dominate when Western media looks at Myanmar. I think we tend to be very fixated on the big names, the Totals, Chevrons, all the others you just mentioned, the big, just recognisable brand names. But what's your impression of the I guess a lot of those Asian conglomerates and groups are, are less prominent, less known in the West in particular. What's your...
I think a lot of them have paused their operations, but they have not spoken out. Those in bed with the regime has not said anything at all. So I think now it really depends on whether there will be pressure to force them to react in the way that we see Telenor or the Western chambers have reacted. You have Alibaba, you have Ant Group, you have Japanese KDDI, or Thai Bet, which owns Grand Royal, and And I think if they all come up to say something or do something, the regime will feel a lot more pressure to respond to business concerns, from internet shutdown to violence.
Okay, so maybe we should be lobbying South Asian companies. Anyway, Jason, you're...
Yeah, I might just highlight 2 points that I don't know if we've focused on as much so far in the conversation, but the first being that things can still deteriorate a heck of a lot more, right? I mean, what we saw over the past 2 weeks in Mandalay with defense forces launching the first major attack in an urban area, with there being kind of the ongoing discussions and online postings about further such attacks in other major urban spaces that could happen at almost any time. I mean, those are not things that are amenable to a good business environment, right? And I think that the actions and behavior of the military going off and going on these big weapons purchasing visits in Russia, being portrayed with Ming Online in his majestic robe there with
degree.
The Russians. These are the things I think that are going to be really infuriating and will probably cause more of that sentiment to coalesce into the same sorts of efforts, both nonviolent and I think increasingly violent, to try to do things to make the country ungovernable. So I think that if you look back to March or April, you weren't seeing anything on that scale in urban spaces. Now you are seeing that. I think it's very likely that those trends are going to continue. So the situation could really get a lot worse, I think, in terms of looking at stability, both for people living in those areas, but of course for business more broadly. And then I think the other point to maybe also look at is what some of the larger EAOs may also do in terms of consolidating their control and expanding their influence in different parts of the country. And clearly we're seeing the Arakan Army do that in Rakhine State. How far will they go towards autonomy? Will it be that maybe a much more sustainable business environment does emerge in a year or two because it's consolidated authority to the extent that it's basically become something like what you have in Wa State? And the Wa, for that matter, will they kind of continue their adventures in southern Shan State to consolidate the territory they have along the Thai border, really to push to try to build out more of their control over some of those territories, kind of linking China to Thailand through Shan State, right? So, I mean, there's the chance there, I think, in a number of parts of the country where you'll see the EAOs just simply leverage the situation to build much more control and autonomy over different areas, which will have impacts on business calculations. Maybe different types of businesses will be able to come into those areas without even having to think about or to worry about, the Tatmadaw and the SAC and these other sorts of factors there. So just highlighting that things could really shift markedly over the coming 1 to 2 years as you see we're really at a stalemate at the current moment, and these trends in both urban spaces and in some of these areas where the EAOs are resisting, I think are very likely to continue.
Right. Thanks very much. I think we have so many questions, but we've gone over time, and I think we did so because each of our panelists you've all brought so much to this discussion, and I think also as a journalist covering a bit obsessed with Myanmar at this point, I learnt so much actually from all of you with some new light and new ways of thinking about things, including I guess one of the most memorable points is to remember that we're not looking necessarily at a Western exodus, although the impression, I have to say, prevails. I think there's still time to go to see that, and also complete economic collapse, which some of you seem to be mixed on that, whereas a lot of people are out for the doom and gloom scenario. We did not talk much about COVID and the clear failing ability of the SAC to counter it, and that one of the biggest areas of CDM is the health and the collapse of education, which how long can that go, that kids are not getting access to school at all. So I think there are a couple of areas we didn't even have time to get to, but overall I think we covered a tremendous amount of ground, and I just really want to thank all of you, particularly Ardith getting up at dawn, and Vicky sort of delaying the dinner, but thank you all. And also I'd really like to thank Kuntam over there, who had to deal with all these terrible technical issues. It wasn't, I know I would say this, but it wasn't our fault. Apparently it was some possible damage to one of the relay stations. But to reiterate, the video of this excellent discussion will be intact and posted on our YouTube and Facebook. The other thing to remind you all, if any of you are still listening, is that the FCCT has to more or less go down to bare bones for the next month. The office will be open for donations or memberships, but also please consider donating to the club if you've enjoyed our programs and you think it plays a useful role. Personally, I think it's one of the only venues left in Thailand for free and open discussion and a range of views, and we've been working hard on our programs. So right now the COVID-related lockdowns have hit the club extremely hard. There are details if you want to donate, even a very small amount helps, are on our Facebook and website. And with that, I would like to thank everybody for persevering with us if you're still there, and to say do look at the video to see the bits you've missed. Thank you very much, and Mingalaba, good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.